Hey everybody, week 3, and this week we're going to talk about the development of policing from the family, the role of the family as agents of social control, up through modern policing, and some of the comments on community policing. So let's take a look at Robert Peel and the development of formal policing in England, Scotland, Ireland. And the reason we do that is because most of the policing in the United States is pretty much based on what Peel came up with in the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829. A really good thing for you to remember is that deal. If you're going into law enforcement, you will at some point, whether it's in the academy or in your agency, you'll have some discussion about the Metropolitan Police Act, Robert Peel. But understanding the Peel's principles is a pretty important concept. The next thing that we do is we hop over to the United States, and policing kind of began rather slowly. I mean, it took 30 years after Metropolitan Police Act to where you start to see developed and established police departments. Signaled by low pay, poor supervision, and a spoils approach to staffing and hiring. Meaning that if you were good friends with the mayor, or you were in a position where you knew somebody, you could get a job as a police officer, or in the police department, or maybe even a police supervisor, even without any other background. So that made it pretty tough for a professional police organization. Now, as we are looking at the police departments, or the development of police departments, they kind of go through different approaches. And a couple of professors from Harvard that work at the Kennedy School of Government, Kelling and Winslow, wrote an article on the eras of policing. And they talk about the political era being the initial beginnings of policing, 1840, 1930, maybe a little bit further along. In some agencies, it took an awful long time to root out some of the bad things that were happening in policing. And that ran with the idea that, low technology, so officers were either on foot, some were on horseback. But remember, horses, they're an expensive proposition. You gotta shelter them, you've got to feed them, you've got to care for them, you have to provide medical services, and all those things limited policing on horseback. Even though it had started all the way back with the Fieldings and the Bow Street Runners, were probably the first to use a lot of horseback-driven patrol operations. And their relationship with the public was very, very close because officers came from the neighborhood and they knew each other. One of the big problems with that, though, is the potential for corruption. And corruption ran really high. And it's kind of the basis for an awful lot of movies that you see and TV shows. Now, how many times do you see the police show where there's not at least one somewhat corrupt officer involved? And I would say that that's probably pretty rare. Some don't try to do that overtly, but almost all of them have some level of working outside the rules. That whole pesky Fourth Amendment, and Miranda, all things that no, we don't need to worry about those. Escobedo. So, that being said, that really came out of the early eras of policing. And then you had prohibition. Prohibition wasn't helpful. Prohibition was a huge failure by the police to limit corruption, keep officers from being involved in corrupt activities. And there's multiple police scandals. William Decker was a lieutenant with New York Police Department. He became involved with some organized crime type people, one of which was murdered. He was prosecuted for the murder, convicted, and he is the only police officer in the history of the United States to be executed for on-duty conduct. So you have, and Decker's kind of a cool thing to take a look at. Tammany Hall is another issue. And Tammany Hall was the city hall in New York in those operations, and horribly corrupt. And that to continue until about 1930. Earlier 1900s, a progressive, what's labeled a progressive movement then, to look at different social issues. Progressives were very much involved in in dealing with juveniles and children, and juvenile courts and how juveniles were treated, especially those that were orphaned and or just flat abandoned. And it's a really interesting, not interesting, it's a horrible part of our history. All of the children that were abandoned in San Francisco as people came west for the gold rush, try to make a fortune easily. Just dropped in San Francisco and left in the streets. So in that era from the progressives, you have certain leaders. August Vollmer is probably one of the most well-known. August Vollmer was the chief in Berkeley, and he developed a relationship with what became University of California, Berkeley, and developed the first police undergraduate degree in the nation. And he encourages officers to take that and pursue that. From that, progressives in the 1930s, prohibition is gone, but there is President Woodrow Wilson nominates a commission to investigate the criminal justice system. It's called the Wickersham Commission. I hate making some of these things, you must read about and look at, but I guess this is one I'm going to make you read and look at. Wickersham Commission, I know what it does. Vollmer wrote the police portion of it. That brought us along into what's known as the professional or the reform era. As in 1890, the spoils system and civil service was addressed, and by the Pendleton Act. And Pendleton Act said that government employees need to be hired through competitive examination, promoted through competitive examination. And that's why if you've gone to a police department to try to get a job, you just don't sit down with your buddy, Joe Bob, and say, hey, I want to be a cop. And he's okay, dude, you're in. You unlike if you were to go to a retail store that a friend of your dad owns, and you get hired based on that, and you have to go through this big process of having interviews and all of those related issues. So the other things that you see, the classic things of the professional era, according to the Harvard professors, is the idea and the concept of a more professional demeanor, uniforms. California was pretty good after about the 1940s. They really adopted kind of the military concept of uniforms. You see some stuff from the East Coast, even later up until the 1990s or 2000s, where people kind of look like a soup sandwich with their pants ill-fitting, their shirts ill-fitting, um, their a gun belt that looks more like it's from, I don't know, kids playing on the street. But with that professional era included the development of more education. LEAA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, came along to um, help fund college education for officers. Um, Kind of the things that you see from this is that the organization is very centralized. You have a hierarchical structure with a chief, and then filters down throughout the organization. There was such corruption in the political era that the police backed away from the public substantially and became very aloof and professional and cold. You've had the experience of standing next to a police officer at the Slurpee machine at 7-Eleven, and maybe you were brave and you tried to talk to him and kind of got rebuffed or blown off. And that just comes from that idea of that cold professionalism, so that people couldn't take advantage of officers. And if they tried, officers would rebuff them. And that had its downside because the community didn't feel as though it was important to the police and how the police operated. The next issue that you have is the idea that this led to a fracture between the community and the police. You see a lot of stuff about that, and led to civil disobedience, to riots, to things of that nature. Now, the next era that comes along is the community era. It starts in the 1980s. And it's a really big push by academics to change how policing operates. Police became a lot more of a subject of study, and the police were very much dissected, and community policing came about. Broken windows theory was something that an academic wrote. Herbert Packer had started that with the crime control due process model discussion. So in the community model, returned to that close relationship with the public, more social services, and the strategic failure is that people oftentimes rely on the police to do things that they would normally have done for themselves, dealing with neighbors, and trying to manipulate the police into being relationship counselors. A lot of things of that nature. So those are the big things that you're going to see this week. You have your first discussion board in your initial post. Make sure that you support your opinions with outside references, outside materials. That's going to be a higher score. 10 points for the initial post, and then only 2 posts thereafter. And that'll get you your full points if it's well supported, it's on point, and it deals with the issues as well as your follow-up posts. Going to be a little bit tough on these this year, so make sure you are you're on top of that and don't just kind of blow it off and wait till the initial post is due, or do it Sunday. I'm reading discussion boards from other classes this afternoon, and I'm finding that it's Saturday at 6:30, and people are just doing their initial post, which obviously is not going to result in really good score. So with that being said, I'll